Okay, thanks. Scott Cocker is a PhD student in the Permafrost Archives Science Laboratory at the University of Alberta. Scott received a BSc in Geology and Physical Geography from the University of Edinburgh in 2014 before moving to Canada to complete his master's degree at Brock University. In 2020, Scott moved to the University of Alberta to complete his PhD under the supervision of Dr. Dwayne Fraze. Scott's current research applies new techniques in the field of ancient DNA to understand Arctic ground squirrels and how they have responded to major ecological events over the last 50,000 years, so that we can better understand how northern mammals will respond to future climate change scenarios. Scott has been awarded several scholarships to support his research at both Brock University and the University of Alberta, in addition to recognition of his community service as co-founder of Scientific Queries, a seminar series dedicated to highlighting the work and experiences of LGBTQ2S+ individuals in STEM. And we're really excited to have Scott presenting to our Science Outreach speaker series. I'll hand it over to you, Scott. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Carmen. And thanks for the invite to do this. I'm just going to start my presentation and I will share with you guys. All right. I'm going to assume that looks all good on your side.
All good. Yep.
All right. All right. Perfect. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk today. I'm really excited actually to be talking a little bit about my dissertation. So I'm just hiding the control panel there. There we are. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about my PhD thesis. I am a geologist by kind of training, and I've kind of moved my way through towards being a palaeoecologist as part of my my PhD. So I'm going to talk to you today about 50,000 years of Arctic ground squirrels, volcanoes, and ancient DNA. So before we start that, I'd like to recognize and respect the unique history and culture of the Trondakwetchin First Nation, which is located in central Yukon Territory around Klondike near Dawson City, upon whose traditional territory this research takes place. And we strive towards cultural understanding and to engage in active partnership with all Yukon First Nations. And realistically, this work would not happen without the cooperation of the Trondakwetchin. And I'd also like to thank the Klondike placer miners. So the Klondike placer miners are the gold miners up in Yukon whose mines we work on. And so without their continued support and cooperation, we would not be able to do our research. So I wanted to make sure I thank both of them right at the start here. So let's jump into this. I'll start off by simply asking the question, what are ground squirrels and why are we interested in them? So Arctic ground squirrels are the species that I specialize in, and I'm interested in them for a few reasons. So there's this word here you'll come across, we'll talk about it in the next couple of slides, about Beringia. So this is a geographic location which effectively at one time spanned central Yukon Territory through Alaska and all the way west into parts of Eurasia. So they're a relic of that landscape. We're also interested in hibernation. So ground squirrels are still living today, which is awesome. Unlike mammoths and horses that we find in the fossil record, we can still look at Arctic ground squirrels. So people are still really interested in their hibernation. So it itself has been subject of great interest for looking at topics such as muscular atrophy. So in short, basically, how can an animal hibernate for such a long period of time? And I say long period of time because the Arctic ground squirrels are the longest and deepest hibernating of any northern mammals. So they can hibernate up to 8 or 9 months of the year. Arctic ground squirrels are also known for their caching. So these northern rodents will, in preparation for hibernation, will cache seeds, fruits, any little plant material into their nest. And so it's why we often refer to them as furry botanists. And so Arctic ground squirrels themselves are actually highly opportunistic feeders. And so they have a wide, varied diet, which ranges from stems, leaves, roots, fruits, seeds, flowers, grasses, mushrooms. But along with this vegetation that they tend to eat, Squirrels are also known to eat eggs and invertebrates, so like insects and things like that, and also other small vertebrates. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But they've been known to impact, juvenile snowshoe hare populations in Yukon. So they can be quite nasty little things at times. And then we're interested in the steppe tundra. So this is really a biome that is combining steppe and tundra, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. But they're a really good relict, are really good. They provide really interesting records into this environment. So that's why I'm interested in them in the first place. So let's start off very briefly by talking about this term Beringia. So Beringia is really split into East Beringia and West Beringia, where we think East Beringia is Alaska and Yukon, and West Beringia is really Siberia and most parts of Russia. Now, Beringia, during the last glacial maximum, so 18,000 years ago, when we effectively had the last ice age, we had all this water trapped up and caught up in the ice sheets that covered, Canada and other parts of the world. And what had actually ended up happening is we had a lowering of the sea level and exposure of what we call the Bering Land Bridge. So this picture here, if you see it here, it basically shows Alaska here, and this all these brown areas would have been exposed land, which would have allowed migration. And so that's a really interesting part of Beringia, is that at the last glacial maximum, animals could actually have migrated to and from Alaska, Yukon into Russia by land. So this included seeing the migration of mammoths coming into Beringia. We saw horses, which evolved in North America. We saw them moving out of Beringia and starting to colonize parts of Asia. And when you have these large herbivores like the mammoth moving, no doubt you're going to end up having humans following that at some point. So we have people starting to move into the landscape following these mammoths around 15 to 20,000 years ago. And the difficulty about finding human remains on this landscape, which is something that archaeologists have struggled with, is just because these populations are so ephemeral. They're really hunter-gatherer style. And so there's not a great archaeological record. So they're following these mammoths in. And just to kind of reiterate that land bridge, here's another image which shows the exposed Bering Land Bridge from light green to dark green. This is all at one point would have been completely exposed and traversable. But the interesting part here is that I've kind of dotted out in the yellow line there is the boundary between the ice-free part of the northwest North America to what was covered in ice at, let's say, the last glacial maximum. So you can see there at the top here is the Laurentide ice sheet and the Cordilleran ice sheet, and these two basically covered most of the rest of Canada. But you can see in the Klondike area in central Yukon, where I'm circling here near Dawson City, it was actually ice-free. So this region hasn't been glaciated. And that's part of a function of, one, it was definitely cold enough to support these ice sheets. But the Wrangell and St. Elias Mountains and these mountain ranges effectively south of it blocked a lot of the moisture coming in. And so it was too dry to actually build up ice. So this ice-free region, we term a refugia, but basically a place that animals could have survived in this environment. And after the humans started moving in, they were following the animals in. We suddenly have them starting to migrate into North America. We start to find fossils into the rest of North America. And that was because of a basically opening of the ice-free corridor. So where that orange arrow is, that's labeled 12,600, although that number is a little outdated now. Effectively, what you had is you had the ice sheet starting to split apart. And that would have allowed animals and people and plants to start moving between parts of Beringia, of Eastern Beringia, into mainland North America. But how do we know when this corridor actually opened? So one of the tools that we can use for this, or to answer this, is ancient DNA and of bones. And so a group looked at bison bones. That was the species that's most abundant, especially in the fossil record in the Yukon now. But we also have bison way into the rest of North America, Edmonton, Calgary area. We find them, a lot of the bison in the gravel pits too, and no doubt up in Athabasca as well. And so what this is basically showing, I'm just trying to show a simple version here of, you can see that the bison up at the top here sitting up in Beringia versus this bison that's sitting down in kind of Midwest, Western US. And what this is showing, that I'm coloring them. So these two are black bison. They're effectively the same kind of population. They were able to migrate up and down between Northwest Canada and US and the rest of it. But then what we had at the last glacial maximum, so the last ice ages, I told you that those two ice sheets had collided effectively and completely blocked off access. So what you have then is you have a population that survived south of the ice sheet and a population that survived north of the ice sheet. And those in the south ended up developing a unique genetic signature. And when you have bones that we can look at in the Edmonton, Calgary area, for example, we can start to look at the ancient DNA, the genetic material from these bones, and we can date them. So we can say, well, at 13,500 years ago, we had a bison that actually has the genetic material from those northern species and the same as the southern species. So we know that at some point by 13,500 years ago, we know that the ice-free corridor had to be open in order for those animals to migrate and meet. So my question is, how do the squirrels fit in? Why am I even interested in them? People ask me this a lot because people want to look at the mammoths. They want to look in Siberia, the woolly rhinoceros. They want to look at the horses, the camels, all these other large, crazy animals that lived in this part of the world. But I'm more interested in the small mammals, mostly because they get forgotten about. So here's a little bit more information about the ground squirrel. So here's just a map. Not the most exciting map ever, but it just shows in the dark gray, it shows where modern Arctic ground squirrels live. So one of the many joys of working on the Arctic ground squirrels is that they are still alive today, unlike many of their megafauna or these large animal counterparts like the woolly mammoth. And so this one, all these numbers are just splitting into, they're all Arctic ground squirrels, but they're subspecies that have just evolved slightly differently. But what you can see here where I put the star is where I work in Klondike in central Yukon Territory around Dawson City. And realistically, it's right on the boundary of where Arctic ground squirrels or modern Arctic ground squirrels live. And not until maybe 2005 had anyone really recorded Arctic ground squirrels in that area, but we're now starting to see some appear. But that's not what the fossil record shows. The fossil record shows that Arctic ground squirrels were a massive part of this landscape. And inherently what that means is that the ecosystem that they lived in must have changed dramatically enough that they were basically removed. We call that being extirpated, being removed from the landscape. So there's something going on there that happens at the same time that the mammoths and such are going extinct. And so we can see that it's a change in the environment. So we call them a relict of Beringia because the Arctic ground squirrels really have been around for quite some time. So here's a really nice image of the mammoth steppe, we call this, and I'll explain what the mammoth steppe is in a couple of slides, but it's this kind of Serengeti style view, ice sheets in the back, but all the animals happily interacting with each other. But that's really not how this landscape would have been. It's just an artistic reconstruction because the landscape was too vast and the population's probably too small to have all these animals coexisting right next to each other all the time. But what I'm most interested or happy to see in this figure is that the Arctic ground squirrels are starting to make it onto these pictures. Normally, you would just have the mammoths and the saiga antelope, the horses, the lions, everything like that, all the kind of quote unquote cool animals of that area. So what about the Arctic ground squirrels in terms of their fossil records? So in the context of permafrost, we have records of Arctic ground squirrels spanning 690,000 years ago to 13,000 years ago in the Klondike. So that's quite a huge area, but we do have, early ancestors going back 2.5 million years in parts of Alaska. But in terms of the permafrost, that's really interesting because only in Yukon Territory, we have some of the oldest permafrost on the globe, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, which can date that far back, which is just actually, it's really amazing. But the Arctic ground squirrels in the last 50,000 years, which is what I'm interested in, we can see in the green there on the bottom is the occurrence radiocarbon dates of these ground squirrels. So I've just kind of thrown out a bunch of numbers at you saying, oh, we know they're 690,000 years ago. Well, we know they're 50,000 years ago. They're here. So how do we actually date these fossils? So effectively, we use two tools in the Yukon. We're really lucky. So we can use radiocarbon, which basically looks at the unstable isotope of carbon. So we think about stable isotopes and unstable isotopes. And these unstable isotopes, like radiocarbon, is just carbon in an unstable form that decays over time. And we call that its decay half-life. So the radiocarbon or carbon-14 will decay about every 5,700 years. It will half its signature. And so what this means is that radiocarbon actually has a limit of about 50,000 years. It's probably about 40 to 50. So anything older than that, we can't use this as a means to date this. But what we can use is volcanic ash. And so this is where the volcanoes come into the story as part of the Yukon. And there have been loads and loads and hundreds of eruptions that have occurred And what the eruptions are really provide us is a one moment in time kind of covered a blanket of volcanic ash, or what we call tephra, onto a landscape. So here's just an example, like a little sketch here. You have this big ash plume going up into the air. It will start to go with the prevailing wind direction. It will start to deposit. And so if we can date the ash, which we have methods to do that, we know wherever we find that ash in the landscape, we know that that was erupted at that exact one time from that one volcano. So we can use that as a marker instead of having to figure out other ways of testing this. And we are really lucky in Yukon that we have a really good framework for all these ash, these datable ash layers. So one thing I mentioned earlier is that Arctic ground squirrels are reliable or good indicators of these steppe tundra environments. So what is steppe tundra? So in short, this is a very simplistic view, but it's a view nonetheless. So steppe is this kind of unforested grassland, and here's an example from Siberia. You can see it looks dry, it looks cold, there's not much vegetation growing. And then tundra is kind of similar. It's also really treeless. You might have small shrubs, lots of moss growth. But we talk about these steppe tundra in the context of combining the two to form what we call the mammoth steppe. Now, for face value, you might take that definition I just had there, unforested grassland of steppe, you add mammoth into the equation, so it's effectively an unforested, probably cold grassland that had mammoths. That's effectively what the mammoth steppe is trying to show. But what exactly is mammoth steppe in a bit more detail? So is it a cold and arid, being dry, grassland-dominated ecosystem? Would have had a mosaic of habitats that required these large mammals to be on them, to graze them? Is it actually just steppe tundra? Well, I think a simple definition might be it's cold and dry grassland. So think of the savanna being a warm and dry grassland. So it's a cold and dry grassland dominated ecosystem with lots of different smaller habitats interspersed. And so what I mean by that is, if say you were flying over southern Alberta, you're at a plane and you threw a rock out, it's almost definitely going to hit grass. It's going to hit some sort of dry, grassy environment, but sometimes you might throw that rock and it might hit a small river that has little shrubs existing on the edges, like these riparian habitats. But point being is that you would have had a mix, but we always think about this as just this really dry area. The difference with the mammoth steppe is we don't really have a modern analog. And what I mean by that is we don't have an example, a really, really good example that we can look to and say, you know what, that's mammoth steppe. That's exactly what the mammoth steppe would have looked like. And so we call these non-analog environments. But to try and give you an analog, here's the Slims River in Yukon Territory, in southwest Yukon Territory. And you can see the wind blowing there, blowing lots of sediment around. This one does have some water, but it's still probably dry in the areas around it. So it's maybe the best kind of similar kind of ecosystem or environment that we might think is comparable in Yukon today. Okay, so what about the big animals of the mammoth steppe? We've talked a little bit about what the mammoth steppe might represent and what this environment would have been. So we think of the big three. We think of mammoths, we think of horses, and we think of steppe bison or bison. And you can see from this diagram, all it's really showing is the amount of fossils we find of each individual. So if we looked at the mammoth, we have, a decent amount. It kind of varies a little bit through time. And eventually, when you get to this top part here, what you find is that the mammoth record disappears. That's around 13,000 years ago. That's when we think mammoths went extinct on the mainland. So that makes sense. The fossil record of bones disappears. And the same happens with the horses shortly after, maybe 1,000 years later, and then the steppe bison in a similar fashion too. And what you have here with this blue line, it's called summer insolation. So effectively the sun itself, the intensity of the sun. So you can have big drops in the insolation, which means we're getting to colder pieces, which kind of lines up with the last glacial maximum here. And so we're just interested in putting these into context. So what about my ground squirrels? Am I interested, the ground squirrels that I'm interested in, how do they fall into this? So I put just on the diagram there, these are all the radiocarbon dates of the ground squirrels that I'm interested in. And we can split this up into effectively two little categories. I say this is MIS2, which is on the right there, and MIS stands for marine isotope stage. And we use this as a way to cluster periods of time together in the record. So if I said MIS2, I know I'm thinking between 30 and about 13,000 years ago, versus MIS3, which is a little bit older. And you can see that most of the dates fall within MIS2, and that's because it was a colder period, and which would have supported those mammoths much better than it would have when it's warmer. So I'll explain why the ground squirrels are much more apparent in the marine isotope stage 2 when it was colder. It's because Arctic ground squirrels are really sensitive to their environment, and their distribution, even in the modern sense, is largely determined by the presence or absence of permafrost and also of the active layer. So what is permafrost? It's permanently frozen ground. And as I said before, in Yukon, we have some examples of it going up to about 690,000 years ago, but we still have permafrost covering quite a large part of northern Canada today. And the active layer is part of the permafrost that will thaw and freeze with the seasons. So in modern central Yukon Territory, we find that the soils are now too poorly drained, they're too wet, so that active layer becomes too shallow, and effectively it won't thaw and freeze deep enough for the ground squirrels. So the ground squirrels need that active layer to be about 1 meter deep in order for them to dig their burrows, have somewhere to store their seeds, have somewhere to hibernate, and they just don't have that environment in the modern central Yukon Territory. So what that does mean is that in the same area, so in central Yukon Territory where I work, during the Pleistocene, and this is effectively from about 2.6 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago. And so I'm interested in the Pleistocene here. It does mean that during the Pleistocene, these active layers that we're interested in must have been thicker, so at least 1 meter in depth, and the soils must have been better drained in order to have the ground squirrels there. So in short, you need to have an active layer that will be deep enough for the ground squirrels to burrow and nest, or you just won't have them. So the permafrost conditions have to be right for the ground squirrels to live there today. And just to put into context what exactly these active layers look like. So here's an example of some permafrost. You have a mixture of things here. I won't go into too much detail. Ice-rich permafrost at the bottom, some of the permafrost with low ice content, this big ice wedge. But what you can see is it's all chopping off at the top here with this active layer, which actively thaws and freezes. And what it doesn't allow is the ice wedge to go further up. So there's a good example of an active layer. Okay, so we talked about the fact that the ground squirrels are sensitive to their environment, so they're really particular about where they want to live. But what about what they actually provide us in terms of understanding or a window into the ecosystems of the past? So they are really detailed indicators of that. And they're indicating the local environments mostly. They will kind of really be involved in the goings of things within a very small radius, maybe 100 meters from their nest. So they will start to pick all the seeds, the fruits, the other animals from that local area, and will bring that back to their nest, or they will just eat it. So they're quite selective. We find that in studies of modern ground squirrels is that in a landscape where you might have 20 different types of plants, they might only like 3 of those plants. And those 3 plants might actually be quite rare on the landscape. So it turns out that they're really good at pulling in information from 50,000 years ago about plants that were on the landscape that might have actually been rarer. And so we might not find that with other ways that we look into the past. And they're also abundant. So they will store these seed caches like I taught before. So there's lots of material to look at. And there's lots of ground squirrels in the Klondike now in the fossil record. And one other random thing that you'll sometimes think about is the accidental part of some of the things that get found in these nests. And so we think about the insects that might also just be living in the nest with them. We think about the other rodents like voles that also might be living in these nests afterwards. So these ground squirrels built the nest for their own purpose, but you might find other things that where you can find in there, and I'll talk about some of those things too. Okay, so let's put this into context now. I've talked about all these different things. What does a nest look like? This is not the most beautiful nest that I've ever found in my life, but it's a really good one to show the different parts of it. So if I was to split this up, we have this grassy nesting material. So they'll collect all the grass in order to insulate their nest so that they can hibernate. And then for the males, you'll find these large seed caches. And if I zoom into that, I hope you can see some of these. Each one of these little black specks or little light brown specks all the way across here and down are all individual seeds. So there's probably in the order of several thousand seeds within this one nest. So what we can do is we can take those seeds, we can look at them under a microscope, Most of the time we can identify what plants are there, and we can say, yep, here 40,000 years ago, there were these plants for sure because we have the seeds of them. It's a really good indicator of the local environment at the time. But the seeds aren't the only thing we find. This isn't the most glamorous part of the work that I do, but quite often we'll find the turds, the poops, the fecal pellets of these ground squirrels too. And so in the case of the nest here, the same one we were looking at, I looked around the corner and I saw all these little things, and it turns out this is a latrine. So basically where in their nest they would go to use the bathroom. And so we're actually interested in these though, because what it can tell us is what were these ground squirrels also eating before they were starting hibernating, what were they feeding on? And so we're doing some work with the ancient DNA to look at the contents of those poops. Now, I talked a little bit about some of the accidental things we find in the ground squirrel nest, and one of those are beetles, for example. And I'm really interested in beetles. I have been for a long time. And these are cold adapted beetles, so they're beetles that live or live well in cold environments. And here's just a few examples. We have this weevil here, Lepidophorus. We have another weevil here, Conatitula artemisia. And this one is really interesting because it's known as the prairie sage weevil. And so the interesting part about the prairie sage weevil is when you find the weevil, you also find prairie sage. And prairie sage was a really classic plant that probably would have been part of the mammoth steppe ecosystem. And another interesting part about the weevils, the prairie sage weevil, is that they're not that common in modern day Yukon, despite us finding lots of them in the Pleistocene. So what we have, you can simply deduce from that is there must have been way more prairie sage, and therefore there must have been way more habitat to support prairie sage on a much larger scale than there is in Yukon today. So that's a really interesting beetle to find. And then there's other species. I put this one up because it's quite pretty, of Marycus, these other cold adapted species that are quite common members of the assemblages that we look at. Now, the ground squirrels, in my opinion, are quite cute. But their habits aren't always the cutest. So I've said this is cannibalism, infanticide, and scavenging, oh my. And that's because with a highly generalized diet, and in their case, a limited time to pack on the grams before their long hibernation, the squirrels need to be really opportunistic. And so here's an example in the bottom left there of a ground squirrel scavenging on the carcass of a Canadian lynx. We can see them finding the remains of this one here, Dicrostonyx torquatus, is like a collared lemming. The Microtus maiurus is a singing vole. So lots of voles, lots of small mammals. And I'm actually working on that right now, is compiling all these different bones from all these different animals that we find in the nests. So there's definitely more to it than simply just eating plants. They're not just the cute little furry botanists. And here's just some more pictures. I thought this guy on the left was looking pretty full. He's pretty ready to hibernate. And the other part of the ground squirrels is that they can be pretty territorial, and in many cases will actually cannibalize or we call that infanticide, in the sense that they will kill their offspring of other males as part of the kind of to secure dominance. So they can be kind of creepy, even though I do think they're very cute. So I talked about some of those voles that we also find, and here's some examples from some of the nests that I'm looking at. And what you can see on the left, there are two different individuals. We can see their incisors here. And there's another view here. We're just looking down on one. The teeth are missing here, but the teeth would be here for the upper molars. So your upper molars here. And what you can see, the black parts that kind of cover the face here is not just dirt. This is actually soft tissue that's being preserved. And that's really a function of the permafrost itself. And so here you can see some ligaments being preserved. So parts of the body that in many paleontological records, we just wouldn't have preserved. And so that's kind of cool part about the permafrost. And we've seen that from, if any of you saw the news about Nunchoga, which is a baby mammoth that was recovered this June while I was up in Yukon. This is a perfect example of how exceptional the preservation of permafrost can be. Having these soft tissue parts like the trunk being preserved was pretty amazing. And so even though the mammoths and all these large animals, when they get preserved like that, get all the cool press, I obviously advocate a little bit more for the ground squirrels. And here's a really nice example of a ground squirrel here. I'll talk about this in just a second. So it's a really beautiful one though. The hair there, the skin, the nails, the tail, the innards, everything is still there. In the center, what I have here, I'm highlighting this little black part at the bottom, looks like actually a preserved intestine or intestinal tract. And then a skull there looking right at the face of the ground squirrel. So if I zoom into this, I hope in this figure or this, you can see that a little bit better. Here we have like the elbow, some of the hands of the front legs. Here's the front left claw. You can see the big long nails that he used for digging. We can see the tail wrapping around the back here. And this squirrel itself is probably about 30,000 years old. So it's pretty old to have such good preservation. And so what we wanted to do then is we wanted to take that specimen and put it into our CT scanner. So a medical CT scanner people will use, they'll go into it, it'll whir around them, and it will give a look at the internals. Well, what we have in the lab here at the University of Alberta is we have an industrial CT scanner. So it means that we can do it at much higher power because we don't have to worry about damaging someone's cells. So what we did is we put the ground squirrel into the CT scanner, we put it on a scan, and this is what it produced. I'll run it once and then I'll talk you through it in just a second. So just to go back through that again. So what we can do is we can show the rotation here, but what we will do is we'll scan it and then we can take away some of this noise, which is the fur and the skin. We can strip that back and we can look at the bones and the structure. So this thing is complete. We can see the tail wrapping around the face there. We can see the hands covering the nose. It's pretty amazing kind of preservation. And the tools that we have means that it's non-destructive. We don't have to cut this open. We don't have to look at it to know all the contents of it. So this was a really awesome specimen. So just to move on a little bit here, I'm about half an hour into the talk. I want to just talk a little bit some of the work I'm doing even now. This was just from in August. I just got back in August from doing a field season. And what we have here is one of my sites at Hunker Creek in the Klondike. And what we have, all these different colors represent different things. So here is one little section where all the green little flagging tape are these nests that I'm interested in, and all the orange flagging tape represent the burrows. So these burrows are connecting the nests. They're living in a kind of semi-colonial life. And so we can look at this site. So I really went to town on this. We also took some permafrost cores. So I don't know if you can see just beside my fellow lab mate, Alejandro, you can see these cores here that we've drilled into the permafrost. And from that, we can actually extract ancient DNA. And I'll talk a little bit about the DNA in a little bit here. And I'm going to show you a little bit of some of the contents of this nest. If we zoom in, that's that nest there. You can see the back of the skull here. And on the right, you can see the actual head of an Arctic ground squirrel preserved pretty amazingly. Not as good as the last one, but still very good. And just to go back and show you, one thing that we do have running through this section that I was interested in is we talked about that tephra, that volcanic ash. So can you see, if you can see this white patch here? This is all volcanic ash, and it's not great in the picture, but it runs all the way through, peeks out a little bit here, and runs up all the way to the top left of the screen. So this volcanic ash puts us in time. We know this is a volcano called Dawson. It puts us around about 25,000 years ago. And so we can look at this tephra in a little bit more detail. So why, we talked about that they provide us some age, some chronology for this area, and the Dawson tephra is a really classic one in this part of the world. So the Dawson tephra was sourced from a volcano in southwest Alaska. It traveled over 1,000 kilometers to where it is in Dawson now. But the amazing part about this volcano is that it must have been massive, because we find deposits of ash 1,000 kilometers away that can be nearly a meter thick here. And there's an example just on the right of one of these exposures of that tephra. So when we look a little bit closer to tephra, this isn't Dawson itself, but this is a shard of glass, because that's effectively what volcanic ash is made up of, with lots of tiny shards of glass. There's a really beautiful picture under a scanning electron microscope of some glass. We can zap that effectively to look at the chemical composition. And the chemical composition of glass shards in tephra can be really useful to discriminating between different eruptions. Now, you might have a bunch of tephra that looks white and looks the same, and it's really hard to distinguish, but they all have very unique individual geochemical or chemical characteristics that allow us to separate them. So you can see that with the old Crow tephra and the Dawson tephra clump, all these different little sample points clump, so that we're pretty confident that we had a Dawson eruption. So one of my questions is, what are the impacts of the small mammal community? You throw a 1 meter thick ash layer on top of a landscape, the small mammals are really going to struggle. So I'm interested, that's what I'm doing right now. That's some of the work I'm working on. So do we see the population being replaced? Do you have an extinction of locally of a bunch of animals, and then other animals, once the ash is kind of moved around, or the grass is kind of grown through, they can scavenge again? Do we find that the animals are coming back onto the landscape? Do we see them shifting their diet? So they are surviving, but they're saying, hey, I can't eat that plant anymore. It's completely covered. So I'm going to have to eat maybe more meat in this case. Or do we see a loss in diversity? Do we lose species completely from this area with that ashfall? So those are some of the questions I'm interested in. And we can use different methods to do that. So we can use ancient DNA, which is signified by the little DNA strand or the little candy looking thing. We can use isotopes, which I won't go into in this talk. And then we can look at the bones themselves and identify the bones. So I'm going to touch last here just about some of the ancient DNA work that goes on just in general, and then we'll wrap up the talk. So ancient DNA has been a bit of a revolution, and it's really interesting. And there's certain factors we need to take into consideration when we're using it. So one thing is that it decays like everything else. As soon as you die, you start to decay, your DNA starts to break down, your skin starts to break down. So we have to be very careful that when we find ancient DNA, it's not as if you have a fresh piece of skin or fresh hair. You have a really decayed piece of material that we need to piece back together in order to get an answer. And for that, we rely heavily on technology, which is always advancing, and I'll talk about that in a little second. And in the early days, it was really expensive to do this work, but now we're seeing it getting cheaper, and that allows us to do more analysis and answer more interesting questions. But one of the really important things here is the preservation. And so there's really two really good environments that the DNA preserves in. One of those is permafrost, and one of them is dry caves, basically where you don't have water moving around. So the permafrost, it's locked up, and then the dry caves, well, it's in the name, it's dry. So you don't have water moving around, because that's part of the kind of battle for DNA. So here's just give you a little timeline of what the ancient DNA world's been doing. We started with, in 1984, with this animal called the quagga, which was extinct. They basically reintroduced it eventually at some point, and you were limited to dealing with really decayed DNA at 289 base pairs. Now, what is a base pair? It's effectively these two bases that pair together to form the structure of DNA. And so if you remember from school, or if you've gone through that, it's our A's, C's, T's, and G's. So we were limited at the start about what they could actually do in terms of extraction. We had some technological advances, and then we had something like in 2015, like the Denisovans. So this was a complete different lineage of the genus Homo. So the group that we're part of, we're Homo sapiens. We saw that in 2015, we realized that this one tooth that they had looked at wasn't of a Neanderthal, it wasn't of a modern human, but in fact, it was a completely different lineage, which are known as Denisovans now. And moving on from that, more technological advances, we have something moving in, really next generation sequencing. The cost has been brought down, and we can really push the limit of the DNA. And so in just last year, they had some of the oldest DNA that they've been able to extract at about 1 million years from a mammoth like this one. Now, the DNA is fun, it's interesting, but it's also challenging work. As I said, you can work with as little as 20 base pairs, which is not very much DNA. And if you compare that to the modern human, we have about, I think I have 3.2 billion base pairs in the modern human genome. So you have 3.2 billion in a modern situation, and we're dealing with, less than 50. It's not a lot to work with. So when we're working in our environment, we're really worried about contamination. So this is just a classic picture of an ancient DNA lab, like the one we have at the U of A and at McMaster, the people I work with, but we are suited to high. We're fully body suited, gloves on, mask on, sometimes goggles on. It has to be a really, really clean environment for us to work in it to successfully extract DNA. But the point being is that the DNA is becoming an excellent tool for us. So just to sum up, which was a bit of an all over the place kind of look at ground squirrels, volcanoes, and ancient DNA. So the Arctic ground squirrels provided really excellent records of this mammoth steppe environment. it always makes me laugh that they call it the mammoth steppe environment. One, because when do we ever call an environment after the animals that live there, or one of the animals that lives there? But two, because the ground squirrels actually tell us way more about this environment than the mammoths ever can. So I'm always going to be very biased looking at the ground squirrels. The volcanic eruptions are incredible, and they provide some really interesting information that allow us to develop really robust chronologies or frameworks for putting ages on different parts of the area that I work in. So the volcanoes are really a vital part of the work we do in Northwest. And then the ancient DNA is the future of my field, which is palaeoecology or ancient ecology, because it's allowing us to look at things in a level of detail we never would have before. Bones that we might struggle to identify, we are able to pull DNA from and compare them and better identify what this certain animal might be. So really, in the context of the mammoths, move over mammoths, I would rather make way for the Arctic ground squirrels. And I just wanted to thank people in my lab that help me all the time with the work I do, the Yukon Paleontology program, and our collaborators at McMaster, California, and the Royal Alberta Museum. And lastly, of course, the Trontiquetchin First Nation that allows us to work on their land.
Thanks so much, Scott. That was really interesting.
No problem. I'm just going to try and find my Zoom window. You guys disappeared halfway through my...
Okay, I'll let you find that. We have a bunch of questions in the chat for you. Yeah. So Dan asked a few, and Dan, you can say them yourself if you want, or I can read them. What do you want to do? Do you want me to read them? Okay, thumbs up. Okay, so how closely related are the Arctic ground squirrels? How closely are they related to Richardson's ground squirrels?
They're very closely related. I do love the Richardson ground squirrels too. I'm a little bit biased with the Arctic ones though. But the Richardson ground squirrels are part of the same genus. The genus is Eurosatellis, and the Arctic ground squirrels are Eurosatellis parrii, and the ground squirrels, the Richardson ground squirrels, are Eurosatellis richardsoni. So they actually start to overlap a little bit in northern BC. So they're definitely closely related. They just have a little difference in terms of their habitat preference. The Richardson ground squirrels are a little bit more plastic, I would say. They can adapt a little bit more to several different environments, but they're very closely related.
Thanks. Okay. Dan also asks, many First Nations, Inuit and Métis people disagree with the scientific theories of the origins of humans in North America, especially around timing. Mm-hmm. This may not be your area of expertise, but why is this so important to scientists? I assume the movement of humans, especially if it's upsetting to First Nations, etc. What great existential questions does pinning this date down to within 5,000 or even 10,000 years really answer?
Yeah, good question. I mean, in the context of the First Nations, there's no argument, or there's no putting down of the storytelling aspect of First Nation communities, because that is also vital to some of the work we do, is that the storytelling gives us a huge amount of information about the animals and the plants that lived there in the past. So why we're interested is simply, one, because we're able to actually look at the material and actually look at the movement of humans, but we're interested in the context of when did people first start making their way into the Americas. We're interested in the kind of following of these large herbivores in terms of hunting, because where you have these animals moving, we have the humans also following. It's definitely not my area of expertise. I'm not an anthropologist. I couldn't give you a reason of why we're so desperate to know that. It's just in the same way that we are desperate to understand why the mammoths moved here, when they moved here, how they interacted with their environment. It's just a little bit more than simply, it's more than just saying we're interested for the sake of it. I think you could argue that with any scientific field, to be quite honest. That why are you interested in looking at mycelium, like Carmen? It's just that this is what we're interested in. It's part of the history of the landscape. And there's no goal to upset First Nations with the science we do. And that's why the big question is they often ask us, if you can do this ancient DNA, are you going to start looking for humans? And the real question is, why would we? You know, what do we want to even look at that? What do we gain from that in more detail? So yeah, there's loads of questions there, and that's something that always needs to be a discussion and is always in discussion, particularly with the Trondiquichin First Nation in Central Yukon. I hope that answers your question. It was a bit waffly, but.
Dan, I'm going to skip the next one and come back to it just to mix it up. Vive asked, could you use ground penetrating radars to look into the nests and burrows, hopefully without disturbing the ecosystems?
Yeah, in theory you could, because the density difference. Yeah, in theory you could. Our group does a lot of ERT work, which electrical resistivity. So there is some method for doing that. I don't know. I haven't tried it. Like to put it in short, yeah, you probably could use it. We haven't, because there's been no need to do it, because the ground squirrel records or fossils are quite plentiful. So I've never had to worry about where I might find some more. Yeah, sorry, not a great answer to your question, but yeah, we definitely could use it. We just don't need to.
Mm-hmm. Lorraine asked about bioturbation. Maybe that had to do with a certain segment of the talk. I'm not sure. I don't know if Lorraine, if you want to elaborate on that, if you're there. I see you're there. But if you...
In the sense that do they bioturbate the area?
I'm not sure. It just says effects of bioturbation, question mark. So I don't know.
I'll maybe need a expansion on that one.
Yeah, Lorraine, if you want to add, you can. And I will go back up to Dan's question. So saying, are there not all kinds of evidence of species adapting based on changes to the environment? For example, squirrels storing seeds and making nests in car engines. How do you know that Arctic ground squirrels always or have always needed 1 meter of active layer in the permafrost?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So modern Arctic ground squirrels, for example, exist in the boreal forest. They also now exist in high alpine meadows. They exist on north-facing slopes. So they're totally adaptable. So this is one thing, is that they can definitely adapt to their landscape, but it's a solid reason for why we don't have modern populations or large populations in that part of Yukon today, is because if they are living on these flat landscapes, with these grassy environments, they require it. They simply cannot burrow down to the permafrost. So that's not to say that they can adapt to move elsewhere, but it also means if they weren't living in areas that have permafrost, then we don't have good fossil records of them. So there's a bias in that sense, that we might not have good records of those that did choose to live in boreal forest environments. But at the time, we know that from the record of plants and animals in the area, that there was no boreal forest at the time that we're looking at, in particular for the Arctic ground squirrels. They really only represent these really cold stages.
So I had a question. Are there certain kinds of ancient DNA that preserve better than others, like eukaryotes versus prokaryote, or I don't know, like, is there a bias when you're looking at
totally
a microbiome from those fecal samples?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, the difference is also just the overwhelming signal from microbial life. It's always going to be the dominant form in the permafrost, because you have to remember, most of the permafrost is really, really organic. And so when we say we take an extraction, this is just throwing numbers, but we take an extraction, we look at that, and 99.5% of that is probably microbial. So it's just figuring out methods to which we can filter through that. And so we have a process called targeted enrichment, which takes the signal and says, you know what, we're actually going to focus only on these animals, and we have genetic, the genetic signature for them. We have these plants, and basically don't look at anything else, because I don't want to look at any of the microbial life. That's not my thing. But Yeah, Carmen, that's always going to be the most dominant part, which actually makes some of the research difficult because it's an overwhelming signal when you're looking for something so small.
Yeah, that's the part I want. You just pass those data. That'd be so awesome. Okay, Lorraine might have a lot. Well, Lorraine's said while the burrowing occurring and the redistribution of the sediments, that has to do with bioturbation.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely bioturbate the landscape, and one of the things that ground squirrels do like is kind of aerated soil, and you see that now in Yukon. They live right next to a lot of the main roads because that is man-made, it's sandy, it's really easy to dig into, and so unfortunately it ends up in a lot of roadkill too. But they definitely bioturbate the landscape. It's, you know, it's hard to say to an extent that would be really noticeable. We find their burrows for sure, and they live semi-colonially. But yeah, they will absolutely bioturbate the landscape. I'm not sure if that really answers your question for you, Lorraine, but that's definitely a major role that they'll play in their local environment.
Okay, there's another one from Dan, and I don't see any more in the chat, so we can also open it up to people wanting to ask live if they so choose. Has anyone ever suggested that maybe the mammoth decline was caused by overhunting or other actions by the migrating human populations, which then meant less prey for the large predators like wolves, who then relied on the Arctic ground squirrel for food, thus causing the drops in population?
Yeah, so 100%. So you effectively have two competing arguments to why why a lot of these large animals went extinct. And one is top-down. We call it a top-down scenario where they're overhunted, and that's a big part of what was done in maybe the 70s, 80s. They call this the kind of overkill hypothesis, where you completely wiped out a whole population from hunting. And that's not unreasonable. You think about mammoths and you equate them to elephants. They have a really long gestation period, so they aren't just producing offspring willy-nilly. My group thinks it's a little bit different. It's not as simple as just saying that we see a signal of climate-driven change occurring and the animals responding. So we think of this as a bottom-up. So the humans as a top-down, and this is a bottom-up, where climate variation or climate warming in this case, which was happening at the time. So this was at the transition from the cold period to a warm period, resulted in the movement of shrubs and trees into the north, which removed this this grassland ecosystem effectively and caused populations to be distressed and struggle. But the reality is probably is a combination of the two. So there was, you know, to answer your question in terms of the carnivores, yes, it's hard to say that would be a defining reason for why the ground squirrels would have gone extinct in that area, because realistically, if that was the thing that caused their complete extinction in one area, why didn't they go extinct in all of the other areas, right? Why are they still alive today? It's just because they can adapt and move around, and that their gestation periods are much more rapid than that of the other animals. So yeah, there's a bit of a mixture in terms of what we think really happened. My thought is that the climate change or the climate warming drove large scale changes to the northern environments. Populations dwindled and became small, and likely humans came onto the landscape at just the right time and would have made use of that for their hunting. But we don't have a good answer for that yet.
Are there any questions that anyone wants to ask? You're welcome to turn on your microphone and ask. I'm not hearing any. This was a super fun talk and I learned a lot.
Yeah, thanks.
I just wanted everyone to join me in a round of applause. Thanking Scott for coming and spending some time teaching us all about Arctic ground squirrels. So thanks so much, Scott, for coming. And yeah, thanks everyone for attending our talk today.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining.
We heard some thanks in the chat and how excellent the talk was. So thank you.
Oh, great. That's great to hear. Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thumbs up. Thanks, everyone. I don't know if
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Yeah, we'll see you at our next talk.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See ya. Carmen.